It's very easy to notice the things in the world that are happening. And related to that, it's pretty easy to observe the things that people are talking about. For example, back in the summer, people were talking about the riots and destruction of property and the so-called protests, and that was pretty obvious, and we were all paying attention to that. And it's pretty obvious to notice the latest bit of baloney coming from SJWs online, or whatever hoopla might be going on, or even other events that are neither terrible nor fantastic, such as Microsoft purchasing all of Bethesda and all its IPs, which is in itself interesting news. And we observe all these things, we pay attention, we know what people are talking about, generally speaking, at the moment, the things that are current and interesting. And it's all too easy to let slip under the radar the things that people are not talking about or no longer talking about. And one of the fascinating things no one is talking about these days is our favorite elusive country far to the east, namely the Middle Kingdom, or China, ruled by the CCP. And it's interesting because many of us in many countries are still living with an incredible amount of restrictions with respect to corona and the consequences of that. Whatever you actually think about the risks of the illness, the matter of fact is that there have been policies put into place that prevent a lot of things from getting done. Whether it's travel, whether it's business stuff, whatever it might be, everyone has been affected. So whatever the risk might be, however dangerous it may or may not be, there are definitely things that have been implemented, policies, restrictions, that we all have to deal with, and there is no foreseeable end to it. There's no question of it's going to end then, or it's going to end in 3 months, or 4 years. We have no idea. And I find it fascinating that in the past, when I've brought up the specter of China, many people, and I have no idea if they were paid shills or not, came rushing to the defense of China on this particular front because they've really gone under the radar. Nobody's thinking about it. Nobody's talking about it. These are just things we need to live with. But it's important to remind ourselves of the fact that whatever the exact origin of the virus, of the pestilence, the reality is it did come from China. And whatever we think about the exact details, China was very, very late on warning the world when they were almost certainly aware of the circumstances of the virus and almost certainly aware of the risks involved. If they'd issued an urgent warning to the rest of the world weeks prior, many countries would have been better prepared. We probably would have been in a better situation overall with arguably potentially fewer restrictions. But they didn't do that. They were very, very secretive, very surreptitious, and frankly speaking, the best case scenario, apathetic, and worst case scenario, malicious towards the rest of the world. Now, this shouldn't surprise us. The CCP will always try to save face and try to do what quote-unquote is right for their own image. But it's important to remember who is ultimately at fault here and how we ended up in this situation and how they've completely gone under the radar. We all got caught up in the events of the summer. We got caught up in other events. And the funny thing is, the CCP and China at large was probably laughing at places in the United States dealing with these riots and these so-called protests and all this other nonsense that was ongoing during the summertime, as well as the buffoonery and theater that's currently occurring with the so-called presidential election, if you even want to call it that. And everyone's forgotten, more or less. But I think it's very risky to completely forget China's culpability in all of this and this new state of living that we all have, whatever those restrictions might be. Now, in some sense, it is what it is. We have to live with it and deal with it as best we can. But one phenomenon that has emerged since approximately the early 90s, roughly since the fall of quote-unquote communism, whatever that even means, or basically the end of the Cold War, is a sense of avoidance of enmity between large states on a grand scale, which is to say that since the early 90s, more or less, there's been a concerted effort to avoid boogeymanning, so to speak, an entire nation or a block of nations or what have you. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It probably is a good thing ultimately that we don't single out a single country as an ideological enemy in the same sense of the Soviet Union. You can argue whether that was necessary back in the day, separate discussion. But a consequence of that can clearly be seen here as well, in the sense that no one wants to hold certain countries to account. And in the case of China, it's pretty obvious, or the CCP more specifically, that nobody wants to hold them to account for a number of reasons. There's been a shift in ideology, a shift in political maneuvering, the one I just mentioned. We typically just don't posit large state actors as hostile or inimical to our interests anymore, whereas in earlier times we certainly did. And the fact that China has many, many countries in their pocket. And so it can't really fall to the West to hold China to account. Countries are ultimately made up of interests, and they will pursue those interests many times to the detriment of other countries. Sometimes there's a lot of overlapping interests. So, for example, you could argue there's a lot of overlapping interests between Denmark and Norway, far more than you could say overlapping interests between China and the United States, or China and the United Kingdom, or China really any place in Europe. But we could argue that the West broadly is not in a position to quote-unquote take on China, or even name China as a cause of the current situation with respect to the pestilence. And that might be the case. However, there are countries in the world that are less dependent and more willing to look at China with a skeptical eye. Because I think the time and place for the West to act and to engage in argue the punitive measures, whether they're economic, political, or even just social, is long gone. Again, the Middle Kingdom has flown under the radar and no one's paying attention. However, in place of that, there are other options. There are countries in the world, such as India and Vietnam, those are the two that spring to mind most robustly, that do not have loving, warm relations with China and could stand to benefit from aligning themselves with Western countries without directly being in conflict with China. There's a whole panoply of countries in South and particularly Southeast Asia that China isn't necessarily on the best of terms with, and they are arguably far less dependent on China than places such as Australia, the United States, and Greater Europe. And the problem I see with letting the Middle Kingdom just fly under the radar is because it sets a precedent for the future. If there's another situation in the future of the current magnitude, or the gods forbid, even worse, what do we do? Do we hold anyone to account, or we just allow the CCP and their lackeys to just go on their merry way and do whatever they want? Again, I'm not talking about the severity of the illness itself, but rather the reactions to it. Because whatever you think about the severity, the reactions are there, the restrictions. Restrictions of movement, travel, day-to-day life. And most of it's just random. If you've noticed, for example, that many of the things that have been put in place as restrictions seem to reflect officials who are running around like headless chickens that don't have an idea of what they're doing, not the slightest clue. And ultimately, we know who we can thank for all of this. But it won't be the West, if anyone, who's going to hold the CCP and China to account. What needs to happen is an alliance of countries that are not in China's pocket that are already not necessarily in the best of terms, there needs to be a kind of political and social pressure exerted. And hopefully in time, even economic pressure. The issue is the current situation, but also situations that could emerge in the future, and people will just turn a blind eye to them. Because this has really set a precedent. It set the precedent that China can really get away with pretty much anything they want to do, and no one will bat an eyelash. There might be a line here, a comment there online, and that's it. And that's very, very risky for the future of the entire world. Because if China is not willing to take responsibility for what's happened, and again, it did start there, and they were at the very least very, very poor at warning the rest of the world and preparing the rest of the world, then who knows what else they might do or get away with. In which case, we might have far, far worse things to expect and quote-unquote look forward to in the future. Anyway, gentlemen, you take care. As always, may the gods watch over you. If I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. Do hit the subscribe button if you've not yet done so. Please leave a like, share the video, hit the bell icon to get notifications, and I will check you all out later. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.